In the middle of the 14th century, Europe believed it was entering an age of stability. Kingdoms were rising, trade routes expanded, cities grew behind stone walls, and the church stood as the unchallenged authority over life, death, and the soul. No one imagined that within a few years, this fragile order would collapse completely. Not by war, not by invasion, but by something invisible, silent, and unstoppable. A disease that would erase entire towns, silence bells forever, and leave the living surrounded by the unburied dead. History would later name it the Black Death. The first whispers came from the east. Along the Silk Road, traders spoke of cities in Asia where people died suddenly, their bodies covered in strange swellings. In Central Asia, entire villages vanished. In China, chronicles described death moving faster than armies. But Europe, distant and confident behind its faith and walls, did not listen. It believed danger came only from swords and banners, not from fleas and breath. In 1346, at the Crimean port city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading hub, death finally knocked on Europe's door. The city was under siege by Mongol forces of the Golden Horde. When disease spread through the Mongol army, panic followed. Desperate and terrified, the attackers resorted to an act that would echo through history. They hurled the corpses of their own dead over the city walls. Rotting bodies crashed into streets and courtyards. Soon, Kaffa itself became a grave. Genoese merchants fled by ship, believing they were escaping death. Instead, they carried it with them. As their ships crossed the Mediterranean, sailors began to fall ill. Dark swellings appeared under their arms and in their groins. Fever followed. Delirium. Death within days. By the time these ships reached ports in Sicily, Genoa, and Marseille, the plague was already alive aboard them. In October 1347, Messina received the first of these cursed ships. Witnesses described crews either dead or dying, their bodies blackened and bloated. The authorities ordered the ships to leave immediately, but it was too late. Rats had already disembarked. Fleas had already bitten. Death had already arrived. From Italy, the plague spread with terrifying speed. Roads became veins through which it flowed. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan were struck in waves. Entire families died within days. Priests who administered last rites collapsed beside their parishioners. Doctors fled or died. Hospitals overflowed, then emptied, not because patients recovered, but because there was no one left to care for them. From Italy, the plague spread with terrifying speed. Roads became veins through which it flowed. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan were struck in waves. Entire families died within days. Priests who administered last rites collapsed beside their parishioners. Doctors fled or died. Hospitals overflowed, then emptied, not because patients recovered, but because there was no one left to care for them. Many thought God had turned his face away from humanity. The church urged prayer and repentance, but prayers did not stop the dying. Bells rang so often for funerals that eventually they fell silent. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio would later describe streets filled with corpses, bodies piled into mass graves without ceremony or tears. Fear erased compassion. Parents abandoned children. Brothers fled sisters. The instinct to survive shattered social bonds that had held communities together for centuries. The plague took different forms, each more terrifying than the last. The most common was bubonic plague, marked by swollen lymph nodes, buboes, that burst and oozed blood and pus. Then came septicemic plague, which turned the skin black as blood poisoned itself from within. And finally, the most lethal form, pneumonic plague. It spread through breath alone. A cough could kill. No flea was needed. No rat. Just proximity. Once pneumonic plague appeared, death moved faster than fear. People collapsed in markets, in churches, in their beds. Whole households were dead by morning. In some towns, no one remained alive to bury the bodies. Wolves and dogs wandered freely through streets once filled with life. As winter approached, many hoped the cold would stop the disease. Instead, it slowed only briefly. When spring returned, so did death, stronger than before. By 1348, The Black Death had crossed into France, Spain, and England. London would soon become one of its greatest graveyards. Ships carried it north. Armies carried it inland. Refugees carried it everywhere. Borders meant nothing. Walls meant nothing. Rank meant nothing. Kings, peasants, monks, and merchants died the same way, gasping, fevered, terrified. In England, entire villages vanished from the map. Fields went untilled. Livestock wandered freely through abandoned farms. Food rotted where it grew. Famine followed plague, and plague followed famine, tightening its grip on a weakened population. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. People began to believe the world was ending. Apocalyptic movements rose. Groups of flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, believing suffering could appease God's wrath. Ironically, they often spread the disease further. Fear demanded someone to blame. Jews, already marginalized, became targets of mass hysteria. Accused of poisoning wells or summoning the plague through dark rituals, entire Jewish communities were massacred across Europe. Thousands were burned alive, exiled, or murdered, not by disease, but by human terror. By the end of the first wave, Europe was unrecognizable. Estimates suggest that between 30% and 50% of the population was dead. In some regions, the number reached 60%. The dead outnumbered the living. Graveyards overflowed. Mass pits became the norm. Death had become ordinary, but this was only the beginning. The Black Death would not disappear quietly. It would return again and again over the next centuries, reshaping society, faith, labor, and power forever. The world that would emerge from this darkness would never resemble the one that had existed before. And Europe, though still standing, had already begun to collapse from within. The plague did not move like an army or a storm. It crept. It followed roads, rivers, and trade routes, slipping quietly into towns before anyone understood what was happening. By the time church bells began to toll for the dead, the disease was already rooted deep inside the population. In ports across the Mediterranean, sailors staggered ashore with fevers and black swellings beneath their arms. Within days, entire crews were dead, and the rats fled the ships, carrying infected fleas into crowded cities. At first, Europe struggled to explain the horror. Medieval medicine was built on ancient theories of balance, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Physicians believed illness came from an imbalance of humors, not from invisible organisms. They prescribed bloodletting, herbal brews, and charms. None of it worked. Patients could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. Families watched loved ones cough blood, scream in delirium, and collapse in agony. Fear spread faster than the disease itself. In Florence, Paris, London, and countless smaller towns, people barricaded themselves inside homes, refusing to open doors even to neighbors begging for help. Parents abandoned children. Spouses fled one another. The bonds that held communities together began to snap under the weight of terror. When symptoms appeared, the victim was often dragged into the street and left to die alone, marked as cursed. Mass graves became common. There was no time for individual burials, no room in churchyards already overflowing with bodies. Corpses were stacked in pits, sometimes layered with lime in desperate attempts to stop the stench. The air itself was believed to be poisoned, thick with miasma. People stuffed flowers, herbs, and spices into their clothing or wore masks filled with incense, hoping to filter the deadly breath of the world. Religion, once a source of comfort, became a battlefield of faith and despair. Some believed the plague was God's punishment for sin. Flagellant groups marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public squares, begging for divine mercy. Others lost faith entirely, questioning how a just God could allow such suffering. Churches filled with prayers, but also with the dead. Priests, monks, and nuns died in huge numbers as they tended to the sick, leaving many communities without spiritual leaders at the moment they needed them most. Social order began to fracture. Laws collapsed as officials either fled or died. Markets closed. Crops rotted in fields because there were no hands left to harvest them. Trade slowed to a crawl. then stopped altogether. Entire villages vanished from maps, erased so completely that future generations would debate whether they had ever existed at all. The plague did not discriminate between rich and poor, but wealth offered some chance of escape. Nobles fled cities for isolated estates, locking gates behind them. The poor had nowhere to run. Crowded into filthy streets and cramped homes, they were consumed in staggering numbers. Yet even kings were not safe. Royal courts fell silent as advisors, servants, and family members succumbed one by one. As death became constant, behavior changed. Some people turned to wild indulgence, drinking, feasting, and celebrating as if tomorrow did not exist, because for many, it truly didn't. Others became cruel, hoarding food, refusing aid, and exploiting the desperation of survivors. Humanity revealed both its darkest and most fragile sides. By the late 1340s, the Black Death had transformed Europe into a continent of mourning. In some regions, a third of the population was gone. In others, half, or more, had perished. Bells rang so often that they eventually stopped, not out of mercy, but because there was no one left to ring them. Yet even in this abyss, something irreversible had begun. The old world was dying along with its people. The structures of medieval society, its labor systems, its unquestioned authorities, its rigid hierarchies, were beginning to crack. The plague was not only killing millions. It was reshaping Europe in ways no one could yet imagine. And as the first wave finally began to recede, survivors would soon realize that the horror was not truly over. The Black Death would return again and again, haunting Europe for centuries, leaving scars not just on bodies, but on the very soul of civilization. By the mid-14th century, Europe was no longer simply suffering from a disease. It was unraveling. The Black Death did not arrive as a single wave, nor did it strike uniformly. Instead, it rolled across the continent in relentless surges, leaving behind a shattered social order wherever it passed. Entire regions lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of their population. In some villages, survival itself became an exception rather than the rule. As cities emptied, silence replaced the noise of daily life. Bells rang constantly, not for prayer, but for death. Cemeteries overflowed within weeks. Mass graves were dug hastily, bodies stacked without ceremony, without names, without mourning. Priests struggled to keep up with last rites until many simply fled, or died themselves. Faith remained, but structure collapsed. With authority weakened, fear filled the vacuum. Rumors spread faster than the plague itself. People searched desperately for explanations. Some believed the disease was divine punishment, unleashed for humanity's sins. Others claimed it was caused by poisoned wells, corrupted air, or sinister conspiracies. Logic mattered little when survival felt random and cruel. Scapegoats soon emerged. Jewish communities across Europe became targets of violence, accused of spreading the disease through poison or sorcery. Pogroms erupted in cities along the Rhine, in France, in Spain. Entire Jewish populations were massacred or expelled, often with the tacit approval of frightened authorities. The plague did not discriminate, but fear did. Meanwhile, the economy collapsed in slow motion. Fields went unharvested as peasants died or fled. Livestock roamed unattended. Trade routes broke down as merchants avoided infected towns. Skilled labor vanished overnight. Guilds lost masters. Workshops stood abandoned. For the first time in centuries, land became plentiful, and workers scarce. This imbalance shifted power in ways no one had predicted. Survivors suddenly found themselves in demand. Wages rose sharply as landowners competed for labor. Serfs demanded freedom, better pay, and shorter obligations. In many regions, laws were passed to freeze wages and force peasants back into submission, but enforcement was weak. Authority no longer inspired obedience, it inspired resentment. Social mobility, once nearly impossible, became reality for the living. A peasant could inherit land. A laborer could negotiate terms. Women, widowed in vast numbers, entered trades previously closed to them. The rigid medieval hierarchy cracked under the weight of mass death. The Church, long considered the ultimate moral authority, suffered a crisis of credibility. Clergy died at the same rate as everyone else. Prayers went unanswered. Processions and fasting failed to halt the spread. Some priests abandoned their flocks, while others exploited fear for profit. For many, faith deepened, but for others, doubt took root. New religious movements began to appear. Flagellant groups marched from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in hopes of appeasing God. Authorities eventually banned them, fearing unrest. The line between devotion and desperation blurred beyond recognition. Medicine fared no better. Doctors wore long-beaked masks filled with herbs, believing bad air carried the disease. Treatments included bloodletting, burning incense, or applying animal fat to buboes. None worked. Medical knowledge was helpless against an enemy it could not see or understand. Yet beneath the despair, something profound was changing. People began to question long-held assumptions about power, faith, and fate. If kings could die like peasants, if priests could fail, if wealth could vanish overnight, then nothing was truly permanent. The medieval worldview, built on order and inevitability, began to fracture. Art and literature reflected this shift. Death became omnipresent in imagery, skeletal figures dancing with the living, murals of decaying bodies, poems obsessed with mortality. The concept of memento mori, remember that you must die, moved from philosophy into everyday life. Death was no longer distant. It was intimate, personal. Communities adapted in strange ways. Some towns imposed quarantines, sealing their gates. Others burned possessions of the dead. Families marked houses with symbols of infection. Isolation became both protection and punishment. Loneliness spread alongside the disease. Children grew up surrounded by absence. Entire generations were altered psychologically, shaped by loss at a scale no one had experienced before. Trust eroded. Survival instincts sharpened. Compassion and cruelty coexisted uneasily, often in the same individuals. By the time the worst waves began to recede, Europe was no longer the same civilization that had existed before 1347. The Black Death had stripped society to its foundations, exposing fragility beneath centuries of tradition. The old world had not ended, but it had been irreversibly transformed. And yet, the plague was not finished. In its wake would come rebellion, renewal, and the slow birth of a new Europe, one shaped as much by death as by those who survived it. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip, Europe did not awaken healed. It awakened transformed. The plague did not simply kill, it rewrote the structure of civilization. Entire villages stood abandoned, their fields reclaimed by weeds and silence. Roads once crowded with merchants became ghost paths haunted by memory. The world before the plague was gone, and the survivors had to decide what kind of world would rise in its place. The most immediate consequence was absence. Labor was suddenly scarce. Fields lay unplowed, workshops closed, and great estates decayed without hands to maintain them. For the first time in centuries, peasants realized their value. Lords who once ruled with unquestioned authority now begged for workers, offering wages, food, and freedoms previously unthinkable. The rigid hierarchy of medieval society began to fracture. Attempts were made to stop this shift. Laws were passed to freeze wages and bind workers to the land, but fear had weakened authority. People had watched priests, nobles, and kings die just as easily as beggars. The illusion of divine protection for the powerful had shattered. Obedience was no longer automatic. Resistance grew quietly, then openly. This new imbalance sparked revolts across Europe. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shook the foundations of feudal control. In France, uprisings smoldered in the countryside. Though many rebellions were brutally crushed, the idea that the lower classes could challenge the established order had taken root. Power was no longer absolute. It was negotiable. The church, once the unquestioned center of spiritual and social life, emerged deeply scarred. Millions had prayed, confessed, and obeyed, yet death had come anyway. Clergy died in staggering numbers, often abandoning their posts in terror. Survivors questioned why faith had failed to protect them. While religion did not disappear, its authority weakened, creating space for doubt, reform, and eventually revolution. This spiritual crisis reshaped belief itself. People began to seek personal connections with God rather than blind obedience to institutions. Mysticism spread. New religious movements formed. Centuries later, these fractures would explode into the Protestant Reformation, but their roots lay buried in plague pits. Art and culture absorbed the trauma. Death became an obsession. Paintings filled with skeletons, hourglasses, and decaying bodies reminded viewers of life's fragility. The Danse Macabre appeared across Europe, depicting kings and peasants dancing together toward the grave. Mortality was no longer hidden. It was confronted directly. Literature shifted as well. Writers explored suffering, impermanence, and the randomness of fate. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague years, portrayed people fleeing death through storytelling, laughter, and human connection. It reflected a growing belief that meaning could be found not only in heaven, but in life itself. Medicine, though primitive, began to change. The total failure of traditional explanations forced some thinkers to question ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates. Observation slowly gained value over blind tradition. While true scientific medicine was still centuries away, the plague planted the first seeds of skepticism that would eventually lead to modern science. Cities adapted. Urban planning slowly improved as communities recognized the dangers of overcrowding and filth. Quarantine, first used in Italian port cities, became a recognized tool. Public health, though crude, was born from catastrophe. The idea that society had a responsibility to protect collective health took shape amid mass graves. Economically, the redistribution of wealth altered Europe's future. Inherited fortunes vanished overnight. Survivors gained access to land, resources, and opportunities once denied to them. A growing middle class of artisans and merchants began to rise, weakening the old feudal order and paving the way for capitalism. Psychologically, the plague left scars that lasted generations. Fear of sudden death became woven into daily life. People lived with urgency, embracing pleasure, devotion, or ambition with renewed intensity. Life felt fragile, temporary, and unbearably precious. This mindset would fuel exploration, innovation, and risk-taking in the centuries to come. Perhaps the most profound change was invisible. The Black Death broke the medieval worldview. It ended the belief that the world was fixed, ordered, and divinely protected. Chaos had proven otherwise. If such devastation was possible, then change was possible too. The future was no longer predetermined. From this realization emerged the Renaissance. The rebirth of art, science, and humanism did not arise despite the plague, but because of it. Out of death came questioning. Out of loss came curiosity. Out of despair came transformation. The Black Death was not merely an epidemic. It was a turning point in human history. It killed millions, but it also killed old certainties. It destroyed lives, yet reshaped civilization. Europe did not recover by returning to what it was. It survived by becoming something new. And in that transformation, humanity learned a terrible lesson that echoes through every age, that civilization is fragile, that progress is reversible, and that from the darkest collapse, an entirely new world can emerge.